You are listening to Talky Bnonnsense, a grab bag of bonus discussions, short and long, about issues small and large, but always strangely fascinating, which now contains more episodes than our main season, because Smokey's brain is a bag full of cats, and social media is an endless labyrinth of nip. Tell us about today's topic, Smokey.
Today's topic is an issue that came up recently on the interwebs, where somebody was asking whether she should pursue a relationship with a man who had a pretty significant chronic degenerative disease. And I was intrigued by this and by the comments, and it seemed worth discussing because it is a very interesting and complicated issue that gets to the heart of what marriage is. So we could start by looking at the ditches. The first ditch at its most extreme left-hand edge is that disability should be a protected class, not only in terms of employment or housing, but in terms of love. It is wrong, shallow, discriminatory, and ableist, which is a word meant to be used with a moral force of sexist or racist, to dismiss a potential partner on the basis of a physical difference, such as having no legs, or being deaf, or being covered with burn scars, etc. If you are not attracted to such a person, you should feel guilt. If you dare admit to them, or even to others, that their disability disqualifies them as a partner for you, you are basically a monster. People who hold to this point of view tend to lionize interabled couples, which has led to a strange, semi-empowering, semi-creepy and voyeuristic industry in which interabled couples can make a lot of money on YouTube, documenting their lives and proving that love conquers all. Now, the second ditch, at its most extreme edge, is basically eugenics. It's believing that the disabled are subhuman and not only not fit marriage partners, but not worthy of life. This is perhaps the more commonly held view of the two historically. It was standard practice in many eras of history to simply destroy disabled babies, making the issue of their eventual marriages moot. Today, the same attitude applies to unborn babies, but you'll find very few people who believe, or at least admit to believing, that it should apply to adults. I would say most people today sit sort of in the middle left. They believe that everyone is worthy of love, and they equate love with marriage, and therefore think, without really thinking it through, that everyone has the moral right to get married if they want to, while at the same time probably not wanting their own kids to marry someone in a wheelchair, or other things being equal, because disabilities are, breaking news, a bit of a pain.
But we are not so much interested in what most people think. We're interested in what the Bible says, and this may not be the center point between the ditches. We're not interested in finding a midpoint for midpoint's sake. When we say keep it between the ditches, we aren't suggesting that this is like Tim Keller third wayism. We're interested in finding the robust biblical position, which tends to fall between two extremes, and if that position does happen to be closer to one extreme than another, then so be it.
So, can disabled people marry? I think it would be helpful at this point to actually mark out the possible positions we could come to here. So, say we have a marriage between an able-bodied person and someone who is significantly life-alteringly disabled, and recognizing that that covers a multitude of conditions.
There are three things that you could say about that marriage. Firstly, it could be invalid. It could be a sham. It may be that such a marriage is actually not a marriage at all. It's impossible, biblically speaking. Scriptural principle could lead us to conclude that people with certain types of disabilities really cannot marry. Not that they should not, but that they actually cannot. Such a thing would be just incoherent in the same way that, say, it is for homosexuals. A homosexual marriage is a contradiction in terms, because a marriage just is a particular kind of covenant bond between a man and a woman. We have to be open to the possibility that this could be true when it comes to certain kinds of disability as well, and we'll get into why that is in just a moment. But secondly, it could be that it is a valid marriage, but it is errant. Errant meaning that it is malformed in some way. It is contrary to God's design, but not in a way that undoes it as a marriage in the first place. For example, a polygamous marriage is valid. We know, for instance, that Solomon had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, 1 Kings 11:3. Solomon made marriage covenants with these 700 women, so they shared in what he had, including his kingship, which is why they were called princesses. His concubines didn't have that. Scripture affirms that these were valid marriages. It does not affirm that they were right marriages. On the contrary, it gives a very clear law for the king in Deuteronomy 17, neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away, which is, of course, exactly what happened. So although God did not intend for men to make marriage covenants with multiple women, once the covenants were made, they were still valid marriages. In the same way, it could be that God did not intend for people with certain disabilities to enter into marriage covenants, but if they do, then the covenant is still valid. Thirdly, of course, such marriages could be valid and legitimate, and there's nothing at all errant about them, aside from perhaps being unwise at times. We probably all know able-bodied couples who were counseled not to marry, but went ahead and did it anyway, and their marriages, once entered into, are valid and cromulent, regardless of whether they end up being unhappy or unstable or anything like that. We wouldn't call those errant or malformed marriages like we would with a polygamous throuple. We would just say that they could have been unwise marriages.
Okay, but there are probably people wondering why we should even think that disabilities might cause a marriage to be invalid or errant. It's easy to see why it might be unwise in a certain circumstance, but how could we possibly conclude that it wasn't even a marriage at all?
Well, there's a simple answer. Covenants have stipulations. Marriage is a covenant, and so marriage might have stipulations that cannot be met by people with certain kinds of disabilities.
In other words, marriage involves certain duties. This is a notion we seem to have largely lost as a culture.
I married for love.
Yes, but if marriage is only about love, then of course everybody wants love, and you could argue that everybody deserves love in some sense. At least if someone loves them, you shouldn't be allowed to get in the way of them marrying if marriage is just about love. But if marriage is a covenant, and covenants have stipulations or duties, as you say, then you run up against some hard facts. If you can't perform those duties, you're not eligible for marriage.
This goes back to what we talked about in our last Talky Bnonnsense about wives working outside the home. Covenants are personal bonds that set out certain rules and requirements. You could say they provide the promissory structure for a relationship. Love, one-togetherness, is only possible when it is properly regulated by covenant. Otherwise, it just devolves into sentimentalism, which is, in fact, what marriage really has devolved into. Once you abandon the idea of a covenant that's administered by God, you only have sentiment left, which is what people today mean when they talk about love. In their minds, two men can love each other and get married because there is no covenant regulating the relationship and dictating the terms, including terms like only a man and woman can love each other in this way.
Unfortunately, it is hard to think biblically about marriage anymore because it's so alien to our culture. So it might be helpful to give an analogy that makes more sense to us still. You wouldn't enter a church membership covenant with the church 5,000 miles away. You couldn't, because one of the duties would be regular attendance, and you wouldn't be able to do that. So it wouldn't matter how much you liked and admired the church and wanted to be part of it. It would simply be impossible. In the same way, there are some bare-bones covenantal obligations for marriage as well, which have been widely recognised and upheld throughout Christian history. So these are, number 1, sex and childbearing. This can be difficult or impossible if you're disabled, and historically this issue was the major concern. Sex is both the sign of the covenant and its true fulfilment. The two shall become one flesh. If you don't have the sign or the fulfillment, you don't have a marriage covenant at all. So does an inability to consummate your marriage disqualify you from marriage in the first place? Does it depend on the sex drive of the other spouse? Is the ability to bear children a prerequisite? These are questions to answer. Secondly, providing for men and helping for women. Historically, this was pretty much a no marriage by default kind of a thing. In a time before modern medical technology, it just wasn't necessarily feasible to get married if you couldn't provide or help. Even pretty minor disabilities were far more disabling before technology gave us aids. For example, someone with quadriplegia back in the day, if they even lived at all, it wouldn't really have occurred to anyone in pre-modern times that they could marry. But nowadays they can, and that's a question that we now have to ask. And the third thing is rulership for men and submission for women. Rulership is harder if you're disabled. Submission somewhat less so. It's perfectly possible for a tetraplegic wife to submit. It's also possible for her not to submit, because submission isn't just about what you can and cannot do, but, an attitude of the heart. But a man with severe disabilities is hindered in ruling his house, since that's by nature a more kind of active thing, and he may have to delegate many of the practical aspects to his wife.
You might think that rulership is purely a spiritual thing, especially if you prefer the unbiblical word leadership. But, of course, much of true magic is about dispelling such a silly Gnostic dichotomy. We are physical creatures, and our physicality means something, which means an inability to physically lead is always going to throw shade on our ability to spiritually lead. A man who can't use his body can still say, right, sons, I want you to start a physical fitness regime, but he can't lead by example. Or he can say, clean the house for your mother, but he cannot do it himself. Or just in terms of leading his wife, it's hard to take spiritual leadership when your wife has to, for instance, put you in the car and drive you places.
So if we look at the Bible itself, there are various forms of disability mentioned in Scripture, but usually not in connection with marriage, usually, in fact, in connection with healing. Incidentally, I came across an article while we were researching this about how the gospel healing narratives are harmful because they reinforce the idea that disability is a bad thing.
Was this on the Gospel Coalition?
No, it was a feminist blog. But, apparently what Jesus should have done when the man was let down from the roof was to say, no, you are valid just as you are, and then make the owner of the house build an accessibility ramp, and that would have been better.
Gospel Coalition will take a couple more years to catch up with that.
So just to be clear, yes, disability is a bad thing. It is a lack of ability of the body or mind to act as God intends bodies and minds to act. It is not necessarily a curse or your fault or a moral failing, but it is not a superpower either. It's something that a person can and will and should feel sad about having. And in the resurrection, our bodies will all be fully abled. So just to make that clear.
The Bible disallows priestly service to men with certain disabilities, but it doesn't explicitly forbid marriage based on any disabilities. As you say, it hardly speaks to it, at least directly. But it does show one example of a Jewish guy who married despite his disability, Mephibosheth.
2 disabilities. You count his name.
Mephibosheth was married while being crippled in both feet since childhood, and we know this because he had a son, Micah. Leah may be an example of disability. Some people think this. If her eyes should be indeed translated as weak rather than soft, then perhaps she was partly blind. Her father certainly did use a ruse to get her married, and there may be an ironic reversal involved in Jacob being blind to which sister he got, but I remain unconvinced. Certainly when Jacob objects to the trick, he doesn't mention any physical defect as a reason to annul marriage. He's just mad that he got the wrong sister. And I'm somewhat inclined to agree with ancient commentators who see the comparison between Rachel and Leah in symbolic terms. The Hebrew word can always be translated tender, occasionally, but seldom with negative connotation. Leah's eyes being tender are a reflection of her inner beauty, her spiritual sensitivity, while Rachel is commended only for her physical beauty. So I am disinclined to see Leah as being disabled, which makes Mephibosheth pretty much the only instance the Bible gives us in terms of disabled people being married, and apparently having busted feet wasn't a problem for that. However, Mephibosheth was the son of Jonathan, so he would presumably have been well cared for as a nobleman. Probably being lame was no great impediment to being a husband and head of household for someone like him, whereas it may have been for, shall we say, a peasant Israelite who had to work the land for a living, because he would be unable to provide for his house by doing peasant work. One further biblical piece of evidence you could use, and this is really just to field an objection, is 1 Corinthians 7:9, that if a man or woman has sexual desire, he should get married rather than burn, assuming, of course, he or she can find someone willing. Paul doesn't give any exceptions to this rule, but this isn't really an argument, because we know that there are exceptions. If you had an invalid divorce, for instance, we would say, well, tough, you forfeited your right to marry again, so you'll just have to burn and pray that God will help you deal with that. You can argue the same applies to someone who is incapable of fulfilling the marriage covenant.
Plus, of course, you can only get married if someone's actually willing to marry you. You can't approach a woman and say, so, I'm not cut out for celibacy, so you have to marry me to prevent my burning. That's a you problem. Now, outside of Scripture, there is much more to be said in the Christian tradition, and let me give you a few examples at random that I've found interesting. Firstly, disabled people who did not marry. Corrie ten Boom's sister Bessie decided against marriage from an early age.
It's Corrie ten Boom.
It probably is, but in these here parts, she's called
here in New Zealand.
Yeah. Yes, Bessie had pernicious anemia, which apparently meant she would be unable to bear children, or thought she was unable to bear children at any rate, so she just decided to live at home forever. Laura Ingalls Wilder's sister Mary, when she went blind, it was a foregone conclusion for the family that she would never marry, as indeed she never did. She lived at home. Helen Keller actually had a relationship when she was 36, I hadn't known this, with a man called Peter Fagan, who was her travelling secretary, and they planned to marry. But both her family and her teacher, Annie Sullivan's family, were shocked, morally outraged at the idea of her marrying because of her condition. And she acquiesced and never saw him again. And then we've got Baldwin IV, the leper king of Jerusalem, who was a very fascinating chap. He was diagnosed with leprosy as a child, and surprisingly, contrary to the usual practice, he wasn't segregated. He was brought up pretty normally. And he ruled and continued to rule until his death. But even as the sole male heir and someone considered safe to socialise with, it was still considered unthinkable that he should marry as a leper. But then again, there were people with disabilities historically who did sometimes marry. The very first wedding conducted in sign language was in 1618 between a Sarah Earle and a Thomas Speller, who was mute, and the Lord Chief Justice declared that as long as he could show with signs that he was willing to be married, he didn't have to say the vows. I thought that was quite nice. Wikipedia has a strangely specific page dedicated to blind poets, and if you flick through them, you'll find that several of them were married. Fanny Crosby, the hymn writer, married a man who was also blind and considerably younger. She was 38 and he was 27.
I suppose it matters less if you can't see each other.
Nice. Well, they had one child who died in infancy, and they ended up living separately for most of their married life to follow their respective career paths, but they did stay married until his death. It was a strange situation. Then you have William Carey, whose first wife, Dorothy, famously went mad, essentially. A very tragic situation. And after her death, very soon after her death, he married another woman who had a disability who was called Charlotte. And she'd lost the use of her legs and, for a certain period of time, her voice in a house fire. But while Dorothy's periods of insanity were this severe burden on Carey, Charlotte was this great spiritual and intellectual comfort and companion, and they were married very happily for 13 years until her death. And in a way they were sort of strangely suited because she'd gone to India in the first place for her health because of the warm climate. Obviously a very famous case is Johnny Erickson Tada, who had already been a quadriplegic for 13 years when she married Ken. They've been pretty open about the marriage difficulties that come with being a caregiver for your spouse, even with support. It sounds like there were a couple of times they weren't sure they were going to make it. He's mentioned that he doesn't always counsel interabled couples to get married. They've said some pretty raw things, actually, a few things that you sort of go, oh, like you said that in front of your wife. But nevertheless, they are still married. And here's what Johnny says about it. My hands don't work, my feet don't walk. So in the middle of the night, after Ken has turned me and put pillows behind my back, and I'm all tucked in nicely with the blankets up, sometimes at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning, I get uncomfortable. I have to make a choice. Am I going to wake my husband up to turn me, or am I going to make it to morning? How do you choose? Sometimes the discomfort is such that I have to wake him up, but I'm thinking of Philippians chapter 2, verse 4 at 2 in the morning. How can I look out for my husband's interest? How can I put him first? He needs rest. He had a hard day yesterday. You know what? I just bet I can make it to morning. Those are the kinds of decisions that I make countless times during the day based on God's word. It should influence our decisions. It should inform our choices. For me, I think I can be a good wife. No, I can't fold towels, I can't iron shirts, I can't whip up an omelette, I can't rub my husband's back. But I can cheer him on, look out for his interests, defend his reputation, pray for him, applaud him, and think of him at 2 o'clock in the morning. That's being a good wife.
What the church thought about this issue is difficult to research, but we have unearthed certain facts. Martin Luther once wrote about the 18 impediments which the Roman Church had put upon marriage, most of which he disagreed with. Things like not being able to marry relatives to a more stringent degree than the Bible forbade, or not being able to marry a serf. He felt that the church was putting up more barriers to marriage than the Bible did, which indeed they were. Unfortunately, the two impediments that interest us here, he doesn't say much about. One is unfitness for marriage, and he basically says there's so much you can say about that he won't bother. And the other, casually thrown in at the end, is defective eyesight and hearing, about which he said, "It is a dirty, rotten business that a bishop should forbid me a wife or specify the times when I may marry, or that a blind and dumb person should not be allowed to enter into wedlock." Which is probably pretty fair.
I couldn't find any specific evidence that the church did say that, but I mean, I assume he knew what he was talking about.
It's hard to imagine why he would bother saying it otherwise.
Yeah.
A reformer named Martin Bucer, a friend of Calvin's, who actually set up Calvin with his wife, believed divorce was permissible in cases of leprosy, impotence, or insanity. Since he believed them to be grounds for divorce, it's reasonable to assume he believed these three conditions would be incompatible with getting married in the first place.
Although I suppose not between two lepers, necessarily.
Calvin himself had a lot of pastoral experience dealing with marriages, and in Geneva there were 7 impediments to marriage. Several of them are relevant here. People who could not marry included the insane or mentally impaired, someone with a contagious and incurable disease that would be passed on to the spouse and children, someone incapable of having sex, and also, interestingly, couples with too great a disparity of age.
The reason for this last prohibition was that Calvin believed a young man marrying a much older woman, which he would generally do only if she was very rich, would find it difficult to lead his household, and an old man marrying a much younger woman was probably a lecherous creep who didn't have her best interests at heart. They actually had a Leonardo DiCaprio clause. The old man wasn't barred from marriage per se, he just couldn't marry the 16-year-old because, in theological terms, ew.
An article about disability and marriage in 19th century Sweden indicates that marriages were less common for disabled people, but not unheard of, though of course the term disability is very broad. It says, however, already the church law of 1686 stipulated that people who had incurable and contagious diseases were not allowed to contract a spouse, and the law of 1757 prohibited those suffering from epilepsy or idiocy from marrying. Catholic canon law addresses the issue of impotence in section 1084. This was written in 1917, saying, Section 1, antecedent and perpetual impotence to have intercourse, whether on the part of the man or the woman, whether absolute or relative, nullifies marriage by its very nature, And Section 3 says, sterility neither prohibits nor nullifies marriage without prejudice to the prescript of Canon 1098, which is about annulment granted due to the deceit of one partner about being fitted for married life. So, as long as your spouse knew at the time of marriage that you were infertile, you could still get married according to the Catholic Church in 1917.
We can see some of the attitudes of various time periods in Christian literature as well. Disability is represented even in classic children's literature more than you might think. If you think of Colin in The Secret Garden, or Clara and Heidi, or Tiny Tim, it's often medically ambiguous or implausible, but in a few cases it does give us some insight into how the writers felt about disability in marriage. There are two interesting kind of parallel examples, one from what Katie did and one from a lesser-known Victorian novel called The Daisy Chain by Charlotte Mary Yonge. Both these books feature young girls/women who are paralysed after accidents, and both these young women find mentors who are also to some degree disabled. Katie has cousin Helen, and Margaret from The Daisy Chain meets a schoolteacher called Cherry, and both of these mentors tell them essentially the same story. They were engaged, they became crippled through accidents, they insisted on breaking the engagement for the sake of the guy, and he eventually goes and marries someone else. And this is portrayed as noble, even heroic, but at the same time not outstandingly unusual. It was sort of the sporting thing to do. It was sporting for the man to insist on marrying her anyway, and it was sporting for her to gallantly bow out, even against his wishes, for his own good. Now, this isn't particularly relevant to Katie, who's too young to think about marriage, and in the end she gets better and does get married, so it's fine. But Margaret already has an attachment with the young man, and they actually get engaged after her accident, but it's with the caveat that, of course, they will need to wait until she gets better to marry. So he goes off for a 3-year voyage to sea, and she, in the meantime, does not, in fact, get better. And 2 years into this, she has a conversation with her brother, who's a curate, I think, a pastor, some kind of religious man, asking him if she should write and release Ellen from the engagement. And the brother says, no, there's still 1 more year to go, so there's still hope, and she shouldn't upset him until they know for sure. The implication is quite clearly that she really does have to get better to consider marriage. She doesn't, but fortunately or unfortunately, the young man dies at sea. It's that kind of a book. And she finds great spiritual consolation in the fact that they never broke it off, and so now she has the right to wear black in his memory for the rest of her life, which is not long. Again, this is a depressing book. But interestingly, there is one dissenting opinion. Ethel, the hard-headed intellectual sister, declares that if Alan had come home, he would have insisted on marrying her anyway out of love. And you get the impression in the book that this would not have been absolutely refused by Margaret's father. It would not have been seen as absolutely immoral, just unusual and kind of suboptimal for everybody. There is an even more interesting take on marriage and disability in Frances Burney's novel Camilla. Camilla's sister Eugenia is not so much disabled as disfigured. She is terribly scarred from a case of smallpox as a child, and she also has a fall which, in the medically vague way of Regency novels, left her with stunted growth, one leg shorter than the other, and a hunchback. She's able to live a fairly normal, sedentary, upper-class kind of life, so there's no reason to think she couldn't do wifely duties. But it's agreed that her appearance is likely to repel suitors. And what's interesting is that her family don't write her off because of this. They take a sort of hilariously practical but quite humane view of the thing, which is basically, let's compensate for her looks. So her rich uncle, who's essentially the cause of her disfigurements, it's a long story, he makes her his heiress, so now she's fabulously wealthy. And they educate her, in his words, like a boy, in the classics, with the hope of marrying her to a specific boy who is also studying classics on the continent. The idea is he will come home, see how suitable she is as a helpmeet, and fall in love, and get the estate, and all be hunky-dory. Now, that particular plan doesn't work out, but she does eventually get a happy ending and a husband who loves her. And it's notable to see how Frances Burney's Christian faith, expressed in the Christian faith of Eugenia's parents, places spiritual beauty above physical beauty. It's actually pretty revolutionary for its time. It's giving a disfigured woman an actual full-fledged personality and romantic aspirations. But of course, you can't ignore the fact that she is rich, and this helps. And that does seem to have been a bit of a prevailing social attitude, especially with royalty. Being a bit disabled or a bit mad wasn't seen as an impediment, really, because your duty to marry superseded any specific duties you might have towards your spouse. And nobody's likely to refuse a Habsburg just because of his jaw. Nobody refused Henry VIII, and he was grossly obese and had a running sore in his leg and had literally beheaded 2 of his previous wives, so...
You couldn't refuse a man who was going to behead you either way.
Yeah.
Better to risk it.
Indeed.
Having some idea of how this issue is viewed in the Christian tradition, we should start trying to draw some conclusions of our own. There are a lot of practical issues that you would need to think through if you were considering marriage with a disabled person, or if you yourself are disabled and considering marriage. But I think some of them, at least the more extreme ones, are probably moot issues if we apply some biblical principle to filter out options from the beginning. To return to where we started, we had 2 triads. The first triad was with respect to what you might call the soundness of a marriage. It could be illegitimate, which is just invalid, doesn't count as marriage at all. It could be errant, which is malformed in some way, but still a valid covenant. Or it could be unwise, which is just challenging in some way, but otherwise within the bounds of God's purpose for marriage.
It could also be like, fine.
Or it could be fine, but those were the negative triad, you could say. Then we had the triad of duties, which generally mark out whether a marriage can be legitimate or not in the first place, and these help us to filter how to assess a given marriage. So the first is sex and childbearing, the second is providing and helping, and the third is rulership and submission. We've put them in this order because there is a clear hierarchy of importance here. Sex and childbearing come first because they are integral to marriage in ways that even providing and helping and rulership and submission are not. The necessity of sex to a valid marriage is one of the few things the Reformers and Rome agreed about. Not many people realize the Reformation was as much a reformation of marriage as it was of the church. I'm reporting this secondhand based on discussions I've had with Michael Foster, who is a far better historian than I am. But according to him, marriage was in almost as bad a state in the 15th century as it is today. And correcting this was one of the central focuses of men like John Calvin. We've already quoted Luther commenting on the 18 conditions that Rome had added to marriage. The Reformers set about restoring marriage to its proper place and ensuring it was held in the proper honor. So they stripped away most of these unrighteous rules. But one of the chief things that they upheld alongside Rome was the necessity of sex to a valid marriage. This is because Scripture itself plainly makes sex the functional consummation or accomplishment of marriage, the thing that completes the covenant bond. Genesis 2:24 says, "Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." Jesus interprets this as the essence of the marriage covenant, when the Pharisees come and ask him if it is lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause, and he, answering, said to them, "Did ye not read that he who made them from the beginning, a male and a female, made them, and said, For this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and cleave to his wife, and they shall be the two for one flesh, so that they are no more two, but one flesh. What therefore God did join together, let no man put asunder." It's Matthew 19:4-6. It is once they achieve one fleshness, Jesus says, that they are no more two, but one. And in case you think one flesh might just be poetical language for the closeness of the covenantal union, effected through saying, "I do," Paul does not see it that way. When he rebukes the Corinthians for going to prostitutes, he says, "Have ye not known that he who is joined to the harlot is one body? For they shall be, saith he, the two for one flesh." 1 Corinthians 6:16. Paul is here interpreting Genesis as referring to sex specifically, and is appalled that Christians would be making themselves one flesh outside of a properly instituted marriage covenant. It is unthinkable to him, for what you are doing is physically expressing a covenant bond of marriage when the opposite has been agreed in word. You and the harlot are explicitly rejecting such a bond. That is the nature of harlotry. You add injury to insult by implicating Christ himself in this, since as your federal head, he has ultimate authority and responsibility over all your covenants. Note that I'm not saying that someone who visits a harlot actually becomes married to her. The marital covenant, like all covenants, is not instituted by its sign, but rather consummated or sealed by it. A covenant must be agreed by word and then affirmed by sign, at least usually speaking.
This is why historically it was considered so normal to have witnesses present on the wedding night. To us it seems perverse and obscene and a mortifying invasion of privacy. But without witnesses there was no way to validate the marriage, and this was especially considered important for royal marriages, because these were so often a way of making a covenant between two nations as well as between two people.
Right, so all that to say, if you have a disability that prevents you from consummating your marriage, you actually cannot be married. It's not a question of wanting it, it's a question of the rules that God built into creation and reiterated in his word. God says there is no marriage until sex has taken place. A marriage is not vows, a marriage is vows affirmed by sex.
Now, an interesting, slightly side note, but something I came across a while back, was a belief among certain types of Orthodox Jews, not all variants, but it's a thing, where if a couple is discovered to be infertile, if after 10 years of marriage they haven't had a baby, despite trying, it is not only that they're permitted to divorce, it is actually commanded that they divorce. The idea being that it is, in Judaism, it's specifically the man's burden to have children, like it's a command for the man, it's a blessing for the woman, but it's men's duty to do this. And if they can't make it happen together, it's seen as the sort of humane thing to let the other spouse go off and try with someone else. And weirdly, even if they love each other, it doesn't matter. It's you have to do it. In the modern day, because it can take a lot less than 10 years to figure out you're infertile with modern technology, it doesn't have to be 10 years. But I thought that was just so weird and interesting. So what would you say? Are Orthodox Jews right to annul a marriage that cannot produce children?
No, pharisaical nonsense. As a point of order, just for clarity, an annulment doesn't dissolve an existing marriage. It recognizes officially that a marriage never existed in the first place. It's from the Latin nullus, meaning none or nothing. You are saying about the marriage, in effect, there was none. It doesn't make an existing marriage null. It recognizes that there was no existing marriage at all. But this is not true of people who can't have children, unless the reason is that they also can't have sex. Infertile sex is still sex. Scripture nowhere speaks of sex as being invalidated by the inability to conceive. In fact, that would make most sex invalid, since it doesn't usually conceive. For example, Elkanah had a malformed marriage in that he had 2 wives, but he couldn't have had 2 wives if barrenness invalidated a marriage, because then his marriage with Hannah would have been null and void. It was null and void of children, but it was not null and void as a covenant. It had failed to bring the one flesh union to completion in the new flesh of a child, but it hadn't failed to ratify the union itself.
In fact, quite a few of the patriarchal marriages would have been suspicious if,
Well, how long was Abraham married to Sarah before she had children? So,
Indeed. So it would be permissible for a couple who know they are infertile to marry.
yes, I may question the wisdom of it, depending on the circumstances, but it's not morally wrong to marry someone who you know is infertile, or to marry if you know you are infertile. And in fact, I am skeptical about how often you could know this in advance anyway, and even when you can, I'm skeptical about it being set in stone. We ourselves know a couple who were told they couldn't have children, and were nearly at the end of the process of an embryo adoption when they discovered that she had become pregnant. God still works today just as he did with Hannah and Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel and Elizabeth, but if you cannot actually have sex, then marriage is off the table.
And this goes beyond just not making marriage vows. People who are incapable of entering the marriage covenant shouldn't enter into sexless quasi-marriages either. So it would be inappropriate, I think, for a woman to move into the house of, say, a tetraplegic man and act in all non-sexual ways like his wife, essentially putting herself off the market for marriage to another man, a sort of weirdly close companionship life partner thing. That's not a loophole. It's a perversion of the marriage relationship. And this applies not to just disabled people, but anyone. For example, if you happen to have 2 people who weren't interested in sex but really liked each other, well, they shouldn't make vows, but neither should they live together as intimate but asexual roommates just so they can get most of the benefits of marriage. Just as 2 homosexual people shouldn't do that. You remember Milo Yiannopoulos was doing that for a while? He decided he was ex-gay and I think he put it as, he demoted his husband to roommate, and he implied that it was okay because he was still buying him cars and lavish designer wear, as if this was a solution. And of course that's not the moral option, it's all of a piece.
Right, he was never married. You can't be married to another man. And as soon as he realized that, he should have lived in accordance with that truth and completely separated himself from that abominable relationship.
So, to get to number 2, what about providing and helping? That's the second duty of marriage for husbands and wives, respectively. If you cannot do this, does it invalidate the marriage, like in the case of not being able to have sex?
It does not invalidate it in the same way. If you don't do it, that doesn't mean that you were never married, because you don't have to fulfill the duties of a covenant in order to enter into that covenant. That would be a paradox. It's only because you entered into the covenant that you have the duties to fulfill in the first place. However, this is grounds for divorce. Exodus 21:10-11 says, "If a man take him another wife, her food, her covering, and her duty of marriage shall he not trim down. And if he do not these 3 things unto her, then shall she go out for nothing, without money." And this is obviously speaking of a man taking a second wife and spreading his resources too thinly between the 2 of them, whether out of apathy to one or actual inability to provide. It's not a one-to-one correlation to a disabled person marrying, but we can certainly draw some inferences, especially when we include Paul's savage rebuke in 1 Timothy 5, which says, "If any provideth not for his own, and especially for his own household, he hath denied the faith, and is worse than an unbeliever." It's 1 Timothy 5:8. Now, there are obviously complicating factors here. A man who becomes disabled after being married is presumably not blameworthy if he becomes truly unable to provide because of a disability. That is a situation to be pitied, not to be rebuked. It is an occasion for his wife to show the value of her vows, not to break them, because he hasn't intentionally broken them either. But we're talking about intentionally going into marriage with the vows pre-broken, so to speak. Can you marry intending to neglect a key marital duty? Can you enter into a covenant having no intention of fulfilling its obligations? I think you have to say, obviously not. If you discovered that your husband married you with no intention of forsaking all others and had been sleeping around behind your back throughout your entire relationship, and that he had indeed premeditated all this, you would absolutely have grounds for divorce. How much more then should you divorce him in advance, as it were, by not marrying him in the first place, if his intentions are obvious from the start? And this applies, I think, mutatis mutandis, to a wife's obligation to help her husband just as much as the husband's obligation to provide for his wife. Both duties are equally binding and important.
But of course, the situation is not always as black and white. For example, what if you have a degenerative disability like MS, for example, and you're currently able to provide or help, but you know that this will diminish in time? Are you violating any duty if you both accept this risk and make a plan to mitigate it in the future?
I don't think so. My impression is that this would not violate the general equity of Exodus 21:10-11 or of 1 Timothy 5:8. In fact, you could argue that ultimately that applies to everyone. We all have this degenerative illness called getting old and dying.
Indeed.
But it may be unwise. It would really depend on a lot of factors, and that's the kind of situation where I'm going to say make sure you have a good church with wise shepherds who can counsel you, because some guy on the internet discussing general situations in the abstract cannot help you.
Okay, so what if the woman you're thinking of marrying is independently wealthy? Do you still have a duty to provide? Or if the woman is disabled, but the man is wealthy and he can hire cleaners and secretaries and chefs and whatever else he needs, does the wife still have the same duty to help? Would the circumstances of that kind of marriage not make the marital duty basically irrelevant? And if the duty is irrelevant, how can you be refusing it or sinning by not doing it?
I agree it is not quite so clear-cut. But a situation like that does raise other concerns for me. For instance, with the independently wealthy woman, that relationship is going to have a very weird dynamic. It's more like a mother-son relationship than a husband-wife one. Or the independently wealthy man, there's something very diminished about his wife as a wife, and something unsettling to me about having all her duties outsourced to employees. It seems like a recreational wife, just as much as if she were independently wealthy and chose to swan about all day doing nothing and outsourcing her work to contractors, which is something Xenophon in his Oikonomicus condemns quite scathingly. He's like, wealthy women, stop being lazy.
Well, the idea of the recreational wife suggests the idea of the recreational household that C.R. Whiteley has written very strongly against. So perhaps the way we should be evaluating these kinds of questions is not so much against the duty of providing or helping, but against the final duty of ruling or submitting.
Yes, that does help us to see some possible problems, although it may also mitigate them to some extent. Chris's point is that the household is not recreational because marriage is not recreational. Marriage is not for romance, rather romance is for marriage. Marriage is for dominion. Its purpose is to constitute a household, which is the basic unit of dominion for extending God's image and rule into the world. It is primarily through households that God impresses the heavenly pattern into the earth. So when it comes to rulership and submission, the key question is less about what we tend to think in the modern day, spiritual, merely relational hierarchy, and much more about whether you can properly orient yourself to the mission of God, the dominion mandate that he has given you through your own mission.
So would it be fair to say that a man to be married should not be so disabled that he cannot have a mission to which his wife can join herself, and a woman to marry should not be so disabled that she is unable to be a helper fit for that mission?
I think that's a very helpful way of framing it that cuts through a lot of the confusion that so often surrounds this issue. So maybe you could repeat it for our dear listeners.
A man should not be so disabled that he cannot have a mission to which his wife can join herself. A woman should not be so disabled that she is unable to be a helper fit for that mission. Now, this kind of presupposes, unfortunately, that the husband is following the excellent advice Nana Michael gave in It's Good to Be a Man, and actually has a mission before he gets married. Of course, it doesn't always happen, sometimes he doesn't know. But in such cases, you do need to look at the person. Is he doing what he can to keep himself as healthy as possible? Letting yourself go is a red flag for any potential spouse, but it's especially concerning when it could result in permanently decreased mobility or greater dependence. Is he using his time wisely? Many people with severe conditions can't work, but a good man on disability still won't be spending all his time playing video games or surfing YouTube. Has he let this disability become his personality? Has it embittered him? Has it made him querulous and demanding, entitled, touchy, precious? Does he have a sense of humour about it? Thinking at least in terms of a missional trajectory can make things clearer, and in a sense reframe the issue so that it's not inherently about the disability at all. For example, we probably wouldn't call introversion a disability, but if you're a chronic introvert and your husband plans to go into politics, and you know that being a helpmeet in that context will involve a ton of glad handing and hosting and photo ops, and that him not having a wife capable of that will be an actual handicap to his mission, perhaps you should realise that you're not the person to take on that mission with him.
Yes, a handicap to his mission is a helpful way of putting it, because framing it this way illustrates the physical disability is actually just a particular type of broader handicap or inability, which can take many forms depending on what the mission is. A highly charismatic woman with great social skill is going to be a far greater help to a man in politics, even if she's in a wheelchair, than the most athletic, socially stunted introvert.
Yes, it's not a question of being a bad person or unworthy of love or anything like that. It's just a bad fit that may make both of you frustrated and unhappy, and sometimes so obviously so that it would be wrong to join yourselves to the same mission. If we change the questioning to, am I capable of leading this woman and am I capable of helping this man specifically, it makes the whole issue much clearer. And this will depend very much on the individual couple. So a woman who's quite severely disabled even doesn't need to say, I'm unfit to marry at all, but she might need to say, I'm unfit to marry this specific man.
Or even, I'm unfit to marry most men.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be realistic, but at the same time, realize that you never know. Some strange marriages work. There are men wealthy enough to choose a wife purely for companionship, and maybe they really, really need that companionship more than they need someone to wash the dishes and help around the farm.
It would probably help to emphasize the term companionship should be interpreted in a much thicker way than we tend to these days. It's not just about emotional connection. It's about walking alongside him, so to speak, in his mission, even if she is physically unable to carry out missional tasks. Through the marriage covenant, God gives wives the special honor of being able to support their husbands through prayer and counsel and planning and encouraging and so forth in a way that no one else can, which is something that Johnny Erickson Tada talks about in that quote that you read at the beginning.
And we'll hasten to add that this only applies before marriage. After marriage is no time to be thinking about these things. Once you've married a woman, she becomes part of your mission. So it's no good complaining that she isn't a good fit for the mission you thought you had or the mission you have just now decided you'd like to have. That ship has sailed. Another way I think you can put it for either sex, and regardless of disability again, is, am I going to be making this person's life overall worse or better? Because it's a poor kind of love that takes a wife knowing you're going to make her miserable, or takes on a husband to ease your burdens by transferring them to him. We do bear one another's burdens, but we should also do it reciprocally. We should have something to offer in marriage, whoever we are, or we're just being selfish by inflicting ourselves on them. And that's true even if we're in the peak of health. We shouldn't be looking for a husband or wife to save us.
So we've deliberately left some grey areas here because we think there really are some grey areas. And again, if you're in the position of having to decide whether to marry, this is something you need to talk about with actual shepherds and counsellors who actually know you both. But with that said, there are some practical questions that may be helpful to finish with. Assuming that you believe you are permitted to marry and have help working out these grey areas, there are still a lot of pragmatic concerns to consider.
Now, a lot of these will seem quite harsh, but deciding whether to commit to someone for life is the time you do need to be very businesslike and clear-eyed, as much as you can be when you're maybe already emotionally involved. So you need to think about things like simple lifestyle desires. Someone who has a significant disability may always need to stay close to a hospital, possibly even one specific hospital in the world if there's one where everyone knows his story and they have the correct equipment and specialists and so on. So if you're the sort of person who likes to move states every few years, or who wants to live on a remote cabin in the mountains, or even who wants to live in a 3-story house, some kinds of disabilities will be incompatible with that. You might have to live in a 1-story accessible bungalow within 20 minutes of a major urban hospital forever. You probably also won't be able to jump in the car and take a road trip spontaneously if that's your jam. And there'll be all kinds of other things you either have to give up or not be into.
Again, this would all come under the unwise category. We're assuming you've worked out the more serious questions already at this point. There wouldn't be anything sinful about marrying for you, but you're just assessing specific compatibility.
Yeah, it's purely a compatibility question. And a second very important one is, would you be your spouse's caregiver? Many people who have been disabled for years will come into the marriage with an existing professional caregiver or a team of them. Do you want to keep that relationship? On the one hand, it would be far less work for you, and it might allow you to feel more like a spouse and less like a nurse. On the other hand, you'd have another person or persons constantly in your space, almost like an extra roommate. Again, some people wouldn't be bothered by this at all. You might be used to having a maid about the house or flatting with roommates, but if you're an introvert, again, it might be a huge problem.
I do think there's something here that goes a little bit back into the errant territory. Something about having that kind of necessary third person borders on the perverse to my mind. It intrudes into the marriage relationship in a kind of unseemly way.
And a lot of people definitely feel that way and take over the caregiving. But if that's your plan, you have to know what that entails. Do you have the physical size and strength to do that job? Have you ever done caregiving before? And have you researched, and I mean really researched, caregiver burnout? Are you okay with bodily fluids? Are you prepared to quit your job? Can you both afford to live if you quit your job? Do you know the ins and outs of disability and carer support and whatever forms of government assistance are available in your country? Would you, if you're the woman in this situation, be able to be his caregiver if you had children? Would you be able to have children? If you can't physically have children, would any adoption or fostering agency allow you to adopt given his condition? If you were able to have children, would they be susceptible to his genetic condition? Would you be ethically comfortable having children who are likely to inherit, say, Huntington's disease? Would you be ethically comfortable deliberately not having children because they might inherit Huntington's disease? And are you both on the same page about this? Another thing to keep in mind is that spousal caregiving may not be the only form of caregiving you have to do in your life. The guy you haven't decided to marry yet is not yet your responsibility. You have no obligations to him unless you choose to take them on. Whereas you do have obligations towards your parents as they age. So that's something you need to weigh. How many siblings do you have who are capable, available, and willing to share that caregiving burden? Do you and your parents have a plan for their aging, which, by the way, you should? I don't want to absolutize this because to some extent children have to live their own lives. For instance, I tend to think that parents who need care should move closer to their kids rather than making their kids move back home. But you do need to weigh obligations. There might be other ones too, like kids from a previous marriage. Do you still be able to fulfill your duties to them as a parent?
The caregiving question is a legitimately thorny one for me. I'm not sure if the misgivings I have about it are suggesting that a marriage like that is malformed or just that disability is terrible in general, so it's terrible when you're married as well.
And there are other thorny questions as well. On the bioethics side of things, you'd want to very explicitly hash out a lot of stuff regarding end of life and so on. We're not going to try to answer these questions here, and some of them, again, are really grey. You need a good pastor. But it's important that you, too, can answer them, and that you can answer them together and come to an agreement. Do you consider anything less than prolonging life at all costs to be euthanasia? Are you willing to let him give up on chemo if it gets too hard and the stats get too bad? Does he want a DNR, and if so, do you have a moral objection to DNRs? Do you object to him using medicinal cannabis for pain relief? Are you both on the same page as to where you draw the line in terms of putting him into hospice or care, or are you dead set on him dying at home? And in some ways, it's not even about you both getting the right answer so much as the same answer. I think sometimes there is no clear right answer. I think there are legitimate ambiguities in these medical issues. But that's the point I think there are. You know, if I think it's fine for a doctor to ease Non's final days with a large dose of morphine that's designed to relieve pain but will definitely hasten the end a little bit, well, fine, but that's not much good if Non considers that straight-up euthanasia and can't trust me not to do what he believes is essentially murdering him. And obviously, every couple anywhere should be on the same page about these things. But with disability, there's that extra level of urgency and relevance there. For example, what if his condition could potentially be cured by a technology that uses embryonic stem cells? Are you both on the same page about that? But more importantly, perhaps, what's this person's attitude towards marriage? Has he or she wrestled with the theological and practical issues that will arise? And can you work these things out together?
Speaking of which, that is a lot to think about, and this has been pretty long. So let me try to give a brief summary of some of the key points that we've made by way of closing. Marriages can be invalid, errant, or unwise. If you aren't able to have sex, the marriage is invalid. If you aren't able to provide or help, the marriage may well be errant. If you aren't able to exercise rulership through mission or be a help to that mission, the marriage may be errant or at least unwise. But in those cases which aren't clearly invalid, these questions need to be judged on their own merits, given the two people involved and the circumstances that they're in. As a rule, disabled marriages are always going to be more challenging, but they can also especially showcase the sacrificial love of God in Christ. Anything to add, Smokey?
I just want to reiterate that these things still apply to the able-bodied. I think this should be kind of a sobering episode for able-bodied people who want to get married, because they still have to answer. You can be a perfectly healthy man who still won't be able to say, I can lead this woman, simply because you've never thought beyond the next paycheck and you plan to spend the rest of your life going to work and playing video games, and you just kind of like the idea of having someone pretty around in the background to bring you dinner and hopefully not make a fuss when you go out with the boys.
She says, speaking from experience.
No. Or you can be a perfectly healthy woman who still won't be able to say, I can help this man in his mission, because you've never done anything unselfish in your life, and deep down inside you know the first thing you're going to do after you get married is to nag him to take a high-paying job that he hates. And if this is you, if you're planning to marry someone for what you can get out of them while having no intention of actually making their life better, then you should do the hard thing that disabled people historically have bravely done and admit to them that you're actually not qualified for marriage and you need to set them free, maybe even against their inclination, because people, can be blind with love and think you're perfect, so that you can work on yourself to be a fit husband or wife to someone perhaps one day in the future.
If you enjoyed this episode, we will certainly be discussing it in our private Signal group. In fact, Yannick, just as we started recording, you sent through the photo of how you're totally prepared to listen to it. If you would like to join us on that Signal group and support the podcast, head over to truemagic.nz and follow your nose. Until next time, continue to present your bodies as living sacrifices to God, whether they are fully abled or not. This has been Talky Bnonnsense on True Magic.